we'll begin from this idea here that we started this section over here where we were talking about going to greet one's father or one's Rav, or somebody who is greater than you. You're allowed to go through water on Yom Kippurim. So that's the sugya that we're in, right? And which is part of the larger sugya about washing or not washing on Yom Kippurim. And what this led into were a series of essentially a gadatan that got mixed into this discussion, because the Gemara comes to a conclusion that you're allowed to walk through water up to your neck on Yom Kippur, and that's okay. And Rav Yosef had challenged that based on these psukim from Yechezkel, where in a vision of Yechezkel, he sees water coming out of the Beit HaMikdash, right? He has a vision of water coming out of the Beit HaMikdash, and there's this angel that is demonstrating, it's not the right word, but he's showing him the water that first he measured, the angel measures 1,000 amot, and water comes up to his ankles, and another 1,000 amot comes up to his knees, another 1,000 comes up to his waist, and then it becomes a nachal, which is a wadi, right? So and that's rushing water, and he's not able to go through it. And based on that, Rav Yosef says that it means that even on chol, you're not allowed to go through water that would go up to your neck. Based on that, you would say not even above your waist. If there's anything above your waist, you shouldn't be allowed to go through. So, of course, it raises questions about how he learns it out from Yechezkel. Why would we think that that's a halachic directive? Because it's a vision that he had, and also in the vision it's a nachal. So actually Abaye says right away, he says, okay, a nachal is different because it's rushing water and that it's dangerous. And then could be that then the agadic aspect of it continues from there. So in other words, at that point, it's really the halachic part has sort of been answered. So the halachic part would be you're allowed to go through water even on chol up to your neck, unless it's rushing water. So then why wouldn't you be allowed? Because it's dangerous, right? And danger is also something that you're not allowed to put yourself in a dangerous position. But then after that, it becomes this agadic discussion where this water is then ultimately described based on a pasuk in Yeshayahu about water that surrounded Jerusalem, and I'm summarizing here very briefly. The water in that context, and that's from the pasuk in Yeshayahu, is really describing a not a vision so much as a metaphor that God was going to protect Yerushalayim in the time of Chizkiah, right? And famously, Chizkiah nearly comes under attack from Sancheriv, and then on the eve of the attack, there's some kind of plague that kills many of the soldiers, and the rest of them flee. And so in this Nevuah of Yeshayahu, it describes Yerushalayim as being surrounded by water that even a small ship or a mighty ship could not pass through. And so the Gemara links that to the Nachal of Chizkiyahu. It's a little bit difficult to see how they're the same. but what they have in common is it's this idea of water that would be around Jerusalem, which of course, we don't see that in reality, right? And the whole thing of this idea of water building up, coming out of Jerusalem is quite startling. The whole vision is quite startling, and in Yeshayahu,
Although actually Jerusalem is riddled with caves and underground river systems,
yeah, but
including some very
no, but
remarkable.
that's the point. The fact that there's water in Jerusalem is nothing surprising at all. And Chizkiyahu, of course, famously took advantage of that. But this is describing Yerushalayim being surrounded by water that even a mighty ship could not pass through.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite startling. And then it ultimately relates it to a pasuk in Zechariah. Zechariah also had this idea, a vision similar to Yechezkel, but also notably different in certain aspects. But the idea of water coming out of the Beit HaMikdash. Anyway, if you want, I'm not even really summarizing that well, but if you want, you can look at this part of the Gemara, based on the shiurim that I gave, and I didn't dive deeply, but I did really look for people who might talk about this on the Agadic level in more detail than what I found. The Maharsha talks about it a little bit, but I wasn't able to put it really together to my own personal satisfaction. But I think you're all familiar with this idea of the water coming out of the Beit HaMikdash. It's, as I say, it's mentioned in Yechezkel, it's mentioned in Zechariah, and the whole idea of it is also a fascinating idea. Why is it there? What's the purpose? Like, what's the meaning of this kind of vision? In any event, it's a bit of a digression in the sugya, because mainly what we're still concerned about are these halachot that have to do with Yom Kippurim. So we're going to go back to that now. So we're up to the Gemara. In the printed Gemarot, we're now in Ayin Chet Amud Aleph. And the Gemara comes to a point here. It says, Teinach Yom Kippurim deleka minal, Shabbat ika minal mai. And these opening words are in parentheses because Rashi raises them. It's not 100% clear why Rashi raises them. I have my own theory, but it doesn't matter. But what the Gemara is saying is, okay, granted, Yom Kippur, when one doesn't have a shoe, but on Shabbos, when you have a shoe or somebody is wearing shoes, then what would be the halacha? So what does it mean on Shabbos when you have a shoe? So it's referring back to the halacha of walking through water. In other words, now we're back to the halachic discussion that we began earlier. So the discussion we began earlier, again, is somebody walking through water in Yom Kippur for any number of different goals that he might have to get from place A to place B. So until now, we say, okay, you're allowed to walk through water for certain things. But granted, you can do that on Yom Kippur, you're not wearing a shoe. But on Shabbos, you're wearing shoes. So what would the din be then? So what are we worried about if you're wearing shoes and walking?
I would guess that the concern would be that you'll take off your shoes and carry them, which is not permitted.
Right. Either you'll take them off, or maybe there's a fear that they will come off. In either scenario, you'll end up carrying them. And as we learned earlier in the sugya, any body of water is a karmelit, which means that you're not allowed to be ma'avir daled amot. You're not allowed to carry something more than daled amot in a karmelit. So would you be allowed, l'chatchila, to walk through water on Yom Kippur. So until now, we're talking about on Shabbat. I'm sorry, on Shabbat. So granted, until now we're talking about Yom Kippur. We didn't have the issue of shoes because people aren't wearing footwear at all. But what about on Shabbos? So Amar Nehemiah Chatnei Devei Nesiya. So Nehemiah, the son-in-law of the house of the Nasi, he said, Anna Chazite l'Rebbi Ami v'Rebbi Asi, Dematu Urkuma Demaya, v'Yavru Derech Balbush. So he said, I saw Rebbe Ami and Rebbe Asi when they came to like a little stream of water. They passed through it while they were wearing, meaning while they were wearing their shoes. We don't, in modern Hebrew, we don't use the term, like the verb lavash with shoes. We use the term linol, but they're using it in the general sense. It means they were wearing their shoes as they went through water. And he doesn't say when this was, but given the context, we can assume that it was on Shabbat. So he saw these two Rabbanim. They walked through water on Shabbat with their shoes on. Okay. So that would seem to answer our question that on Shabbat you are allowed to walk through water with your shoes. Then the Gemara goes on to say, Tenach minal. So that's okay. Like, granted, we would let you do that with a shoe. Sandal my ikalameimar. But if you're wearing sandals, then what can you say? So what's the problem with sandals that's different than shoes?
I would guess they could come off more easily.
Yeah, presumably they're going to come off more easily. That's the implication here. So Amar Rav Rihumi. So Rav Rihumi said, Ana chazite leRavina de avar derech malbush. So he says, I saw Ravina, who did go through, meaning he went through water while he was wearing sandals, right? Rav Ashi Amar, sandal lechatchila lo. So Rav Ashi says, lechatchila, we don't wear sandals on Shabbos because of this. We don't wear sandals on Shabbos. You're not allowed to walk through water wearing sandals on Shabbos, is what he's saying. Right? So even though there was a Maaseh Rav that Rav Rihumi said, I saw Ravina do this, but Rav Ashi says, l'chatchila, you shouldn't do this. So based on this, we would say that on Shabbos, you would be allowed to walk through water with your shoes on, but not with your sandals. Now, given the reason for each of them, in terms of practical halacha, it's really going to depend on what kind of shoes you're wearing and what kind of sandals you're wearing. Because as Michael said, the chashash with sandals would seem to be that they'll come off more easily. But what if you have sandals that actually are bound on your foot very firmly, and you have shoes that slip right off? So we have to bear in mind what the difference is. So that would be the difference. Anyway, you never know. It could happen to you that you might need to walk through water on Shabbos. Let's just look at Rashi for a moment. So Rashi says, Hatenach Yoma Kippurim lo garsina. So he says these words, Hatenach Yoma Kippurim, he says we don't learn those. In other words, those are, as it were, erased. And this is what we learn. Shabbos Ti'ika Manal Mai. Shabbos Ti'ika Minal Mai. What's the din of Shabbos regarding wearing shoes. And Rashi says, Mishari la'avur b'mayim. Is it permissible to go through water wearing shoes? O dilma chashinan dilma nafal mikrae v'ate la'itunayim. Or are we worried that maybe the shoe will fall off of your foot and you'll come to carry it? So this is where Rashi says that explicitly. So then we have the testimony about Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Yassi that did go through water. Ve'avru derech malbush. And Rashi says, what does it mean, derech malbush? That went by way of wearing. He says, bina aleihem avruoto. It means that they were wearing their shoes when they went through. Sandal ma'i neymar. And Rashi says, sandal mai she'eno yachol lahadko lekashro yafeh beraglo k'mo minal. You can't tighten it and tie it well to your leg, to your foot, the same way as with a shoe. So, again, you have to look at ancient footwear. We actually have pretty good idea of what sandals and shoes looked like back in the Second Temple period, late Second Temple period. So it makes sense. All right. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. We can look at this in the halacha. I'll show you, but I want to go through the next little part. We have an interesting story here. Reish Galuta ikla lehegronia lebei Rav Natan. So the Reish Galuta, right, the head of the diaspora, happened to come, or he's damein, like he ended up being at Hegronia, which is a place in Babel, and he was at the Beit Midrash of Rav Natan. So Rafram, v'chuhu Rabbanan atu l'firka. Rafram, who was an Amora, and all the other rabbis went to the shiur of the Reish Galuta. Ravina loat, but Ravina did not go. So a little bit about the politics behind this before we go on. So the Reish Galuta, of course, was a position that was given to someone who was supposed to be in the line of David HaMelech, and it was a position of that was given as a leader of the Jewish community. He was the Reish Galut, he was the Rosh HaGalut. The Reish Galuta was not necessarily a great Talmid Chacham. He could have been, but not necessarily. Because of the nature of the position, he got the position mainly because of his heritage and not because of his status as a Chacham. In a way, I don't want to draw an exact parallel, but it's kind of like becoming Rav Rashi in Israel, where it's essentially a political position to become the Rav Rashi. The Reish Galuta was a similar thing. He would be a representative of the Jews to the Babylonian government and maybe have other ceremonial position, but he wasn't necessarily widely respected as being the Gadol Hador. So when Ravina doesn't come to his shiur, it could be seen as a kind of insult to the Reish Galuta that he didn't come. So Lamachar by Rafram Lafuke Ravina Mida'ate de Reish Galuta. So Rafram, the next day, he wanted. I'll translate this literally. Right? I'll translate it literally to Hebrew, right? Ratzah Rafram lahotzi l'Ravina mida'ato shel hareish galuta. Now, in modern Hebrew, when we say "lotzimi da'at," it means to go crazy, but that's not what it means here. It means that he wanted to remove Ravina from the opinion of the Reish Galuta. The implication is that the Reish Galuta must have been very upset that Ravina. So Ravina, by the way, of course, we just quoted a moment ago, we quoted all over Shas, was one of the Gedolei Hador. Ravina and Ravashi were the great Gedolei Hador of what was essentially the end of what we now know as the Tkufat Gemara. So Ravina not showing up to the drasha of the Reish Galuta could have been seen as a great insult to the Reish Galuta. So Rafram wanted to make peace. He didn't want the Reish Galuta to be upset with him. So he goes to Ravina. He goes to Ravina the next day. Amarle, Maita amalo atamar lefirkan. So he just asks him outright. He says, "What's the reason that Adoni, right? That my master. Why didn't you go to the drasha?" Amarle, havakaiv they cry. He said, my leg hurt me. In other words, I really wasn't able to walk so well because my leg, or it's as we'll see from the Hemshech, it's karat in Aramaic can be like in Hebrew, it's regel, so it can be in the leg or the foot. So he's saying really, he says, my foot hurt me. So he's saying, my foot hurt me, I couldn't really walk, I couldn't go. So Rafram challenges him, he says, then you should have put on a shoe. Why didn't you just put on a shoe and then come? So Gava de Karaya Haba. It was the back of my foot, the back of his foot, meaning the gav, like in other words, really it's the outside of his foot, the top of his foot was going to hurt him, and putting on a shoe was going to hurt. It sounds like he had either something, maybe something on the surface of the top of his foot. So he wasn't really able to put on shoes because that would hurt his foot maybe even more. So then Ram says to him, he says, then you should have put on a sandal. He said, no, but there was like a shlulit of mayim, right? There was like a little stream of water that I would have to go through along the way. So then Rafram says to him, then you should have worn your sandal and gone through. So and then we'll just read the last line. Amarle lo sabar lamar lahad amar Ravashi. Don't you, Rafram, don't you hold what Ravashi said, so that we had just learned now in the sugya, sandal lechatchila lo. So let's just put together the whole story. So first of all, what day of the week was the Reish Galuta's drasha?
Shabbat.
How do you know?
Well, we certainly know from the end.
You know from the end. And how do we know from the end?
Because the opinion is cited, an opinion that one should not wear one's sandal going through water is cited.
Okay, so we understand from the end, the way the sugya ends, that the drasha was on Shabbat, which makes sense. Not just in terms of our sugya, but that would be the time when a Rav would give a major drasha on Shabbat. So we understand that. And we also understand why this story is being brought here because it has to do with this halakha that we just learned. Wait a second. Right. So Rafram. So okay. So here. So again, given the context of the story, Rafram is concerned about Ravina in possibly insulting the Reish Galuta, and apparently the Reish Galuta was upset, and this is why Rafram is going to smooth things over. So when he hears that, when Ravina says to him, "Look, I couldn't go because my foot hurt," so he challenges him, and each time Ravina has an answer. So the first thing is he says, like, you could have put on shoes. Agav, what you see from here is, people didn't always wear shoes, just agav, right? Because Rafram's understanding when Ravina says that his foot hurt is that, okay, you didn't have to come barefoot, but the implication is otherwise, you could have come barefoot. That would have been apparently not so uncommon. So he says you should have put on a shoe. You should have put on a shoe. And he says, no, but it hurt the back of my foot. So he says you should have put on a sandal. I think Rashi may understand the sandal thing a little bit differently because he says, mirma sandal shehu rachav, that the sandal is wide. So it could be that Rashi understands that still the wound is on the bottom of his foot, but the sandal is wider than a shoe. Again,
so yeah, I guess that would raise that sort of that raise the obvious line. The sandal is wide, I can't cross over.
I'm missing your joke. The
There's a famous Irish song. Never mind.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Shay?
Yes.
Could it have something to do with the knots you do when you put on the sandal instead of a shoe or something like this?
It's interesting you say that. Because that is a concern. The Gemara in Shabbat talks about this issue of knots, but you're right to bring it up because different kinds of, especially not just shoes, but especially sandals, were sometimes had a lot of straps and they were kind of elaborate the way they would be tied up. But that isn't the problem here. There was a way of, putting your sandalim on or putting your shoes on, like the way we do now. Like when we tie our shoes today, we use a slip knot. We use a knot that's not considered to be a knot for the purposes of tying a knot on Shabbat. So that doesn't seem to be the issue. In any event, what Rafram...
The shoes hold water, and the sandal doesn't. I don't know. But maybe you would carry water or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's the idea that the water would build up. That doesn't seem to be a real issue because it's not. Then it would be davar she'eino mitkaven. In other words, if you walk, in other words, your question is this: what if you're wearing shoes and the shoes are closed? So when you walk through water will come into them, and when you leave the water, when you get out of the water, you'll be carrying the water in your shoe.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't seem to be really an issue halachically. It's a davar she'eino mitkaven. It's something that you don't intend to do, and also I'm not sure how much of an issue it was really. In other words, because the way the shoes were made, it's probably going to leak out very quickly. So it's not really a way of carrying the.
So what is the issue?
What's that?
What is the issue?
Oh, so the issue. No, so the issue is what we.
I don't see any difference in.
No. So the issue is. So what is the issue? Michael Werner, what's the issue here?
Well, the issue is that you might end up carrying either your shoe or your sandal, or it might come off, in which you'll have to pick it up and carry it.
Exactly. So it's the same issues that we brought up before. So now this is Maseh Shehaya. So it's the Maseh Shelo Haya, right? Because in fact, Ravina doesn't go through the water. But so Rafram though is interrogating him, and he's saying, "Look, why didn't you come?" And probably Ravina understands the implication of Rafram's question, which is it was seen as a slight, as an insult to the Reish Galuta that you didn't show up yesterday. So Ravina says, "Okay, but I had an ache in my foot." So he says, "Okay, you could have worn shoes." He says, "No, but I couldn't wear shoes because that would have made it feel worse, the nature of whatever wound or ache he had." He says, "Okay, you could have worn a sandal. And then that wouldn't have been the problem." He says, "No, but then I would have to go through water to get to the shiur, and if my only option was wearing sandals, so then I couldn't go, because I'm not allowed to walk through water wearing sandals on Shabbat." So Rafram says, "No, but if you're wearing them, why didn't you wear, like if you're wearing the sandals, it shouldn't be a problem. You should have just worn them when you're going through the water." So he says, "But don't you hold like the way Rav Ashi paskined, and he paskined sandal lechatchila lo. You're not allowed to wear a sandal lechatchila on Shabbat while going through water for this reason, but we're afraid it's going to come off and you'll end up carrying it." So that's the end of the story. So it's interesting, Paul. I see, I see you shaking.
You could also carry your shoes, for instance.
No, you can't. No,
Why? Why not? Why not?
No,
On
no.
Shabbat, you can't carry it. Yeah, I mean, water is karmelit. You can't carry it in karmelit.
No, I think I understand. I think Paul's asking a different question, but we addressed it earlier. The point is that if you walk through water with your shoe, the implication is that we're not worried that the shoe will come off. The shoe was more, like Rashi said earlier, you can tighten that more onto your foot than the sandal. So again, that's a reflection of the reality of the kind of footwear that they had, that the shoe would stay on, and there was a chashash that the sandal would come off. That's the implication. That's what we learned earlier in the sugya, and now we see it's coming out here in this back and forth between Rafram and Ravina. So Rafram says to him, "Okay, but
I'm thinking about. I see the sandals as Roman sandals. You have all these straps. They go up quite a long way on your leg."
So that's what I mean earlier when I said earlier, there were different models. I was also thinking of the Roman sandals, which have a lot of straps. I think though that those were probably not typical for everyday people. Those are the kinds of sandals that I think that the soldiers wore and things like that. You can imagine those kinds of sandals that have a lot of straps, they would be relatively expensive. Probably simple sandals are very similar to, what
to kafkafim or something like
exactly
this.
to what we Americans call flip-flops, to kafkafim. Probably, yeah. That's probably more what this typical sandal was. And as I said earlier, you see from the whole discussion that there isn't a presumption that people are going to wear anything on their feet. The whole reason we get into that Ravina gets in discussing this question of footwear is because Rafram really wants to understand why was it that he couldn't make it to this shiur? That's the thing. So it sounds in the beginning. Now, if you were to, I read this kind of generically, but if you could imagine, depending on the tone of voice of each of the people, that something's going on here, right? In other words, again, Rafram is coming because he wants to make sure that there's no bad blood between the Reish Galuta and Ravina. So that's why he keeps pestering him. He wants to really understand. So when Ravina says, "Look, my foot hurt," you can imagine Rafram hears that it sounds like a weak excuse. It's like, I wasn't feeling so well. But it's the Reish Galuta, and we know that Magia lo kavod, and that he's makpid and mashalo yeh. So it could have sounded just like an excuse. So he says, "Look, if that's all, then you could have put your shoes on and come." And he says, "No, because it would have hurt more if I wore my shoes." He says, "Okay, but you could have worn sandals." He says, "No, but I had to go through." In other words, at each point, to Rafram, it just sounds like an excuse for why Ravina didn't come. But in the end, Ravina says, "Okay, but look, I couldn't wear shoes because it would hurt my foot. I couldn't wear a sandal because I hold because Ravashi already paskined that you're not allowed to go through water wearing a sandal on Shabbat." So you can read that however you want. I tend to, in my mind, I read it a little bit more dramatically than that, because you see there is this undercurrent of discussion that's going on. But presumably when Ravina gets to this conclusion that he's saying halach is like, in other words, very right, Ravashi and Ravina are brei plukta, right? They're people, they were contemporaries who often argued in points of halacha, but Ravashi was usually the one that we paskin by. Ravashi was considered to be the Gadol Hador, and of course, he was also considered to be the original, or at least the first wave of editing of the Gemara. And so Ravina is saying, "Look, this is halacha." And he says to him, "Don't you, Rafram, don't you hold like Ravashi?" And he's saying, like, here, like the Gadol Hador is paskin that you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to walk through water on Shabbat wearing a sandal. So that's the end of that discussion. So what we get from it is, again, we get halacha l'maaseh. Halacha l'maaseh is you're not allowed to wear sandals while walking through water. And I would say, meaning that you don't wear footwear going through water that there's a high chance of it coming off in the water, and then you'll end up having to carry it. I told Michael this is going to be a truncated.
I'm still here.
Yeah, I'm saying I told Michael that, but I'm telling Paul because you already know this. This is going to be a truncated shiur because I got very little sleep last night. So next week we'll continue on in the Gemara. I think for the next release, like between now and Rosh Hashanah, I think we'll be able to cover a little more ground because it's more straightforward, like this Gemara that we just did now. But just to finish off, I'll show you a little bit of halacha l'maaseh. We had looked at, just a second, I'll bring this up. No, it's not what I did. I'm sorry, 1 second. We had looked at the halacha from parts earlier in the sugya, and we saw them in Hilchot Yom Kippurim, But now we're going to see the way it looks in Hilchot Shabbat, just to by contrast. One second, I'll share my screen. Oh, you see the screen. Okay. So this is the sugya that we were just looking at. So when earlier we said, what about walking through water on Shabbat and you're wearing shoes? So Nehemiah said, I saw Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi that when they came to a little bit of water, to like a stream of water on Shabbos, they went through it wearing their shoes. So here's the way the tour brings that down. Actually, I thought I would digress on this just a little bit. This is the beginning. If you've ever learned Hilchot Shabbat in the Shulchan Aruch, you get to a section of Hilchot Shabbat where it tells you a little bit about different malachot. So the tour, Michael, do I still have you now?
Yes.
So this is just an interesting thing I thought I'd show you. In Bati lichtov kol hilchot Shabbat, tarbe alai hamlacha. If I came to write out all of Hilchot Shabbat, right, this would be too much work. Ki hilchot rabti l'shabta. Gemara says, he's quoting the Gemara, there's a lot of halachot about Shabbat, and also he doesn't quote it, but there's the Mishnah in Chagiga says that the Chot Shabbat is like kahari matuyim b'seyar, that it's like a mountain hanging by a hair, because the Torah gives us almost no halachot for Shabbat, but we know that Chazal had all the thousands of halachot for Shabbat. Anyway, v'gam ki kol ha'arba'im, he says kol arba'im avot v'lachot chaser achat v'toldotehem yuduot. This is also, it's just very interesting the way he puts this. He says, the 39 malachot and the avot and the toldot, these are known. So the tour just assume, look, everybody knows these basic things. This is a reflection of a different time and place than we have now. That he says, look, people know these things. I don't have to go at length about them. I don't have to go at length about the different amounts that you're allowed to do. If so like we mentioned a moment ago about tying a knot, like what is a knot, or how if you're writing, how much writing is chiyuv chatat, or how much svita, or what. In other words, everything has a shiur. It's one of the things that the Mishnah discusses. It says, I don't even have to discuss the shiur. Shalom amru shiurim ela l'chiyuv. The only reason that shiurim are mentioned l'gabei hilchot Shabbat is to tell you whether you're chayav a chatat or not. That's what he means. In other words, but ela avali surah ika b'chol shu. You're not allowed to do even a little bit of them, and that, of course, pertains to the beginning of our sugya about chatzi shiur. Chatzi shiur is asur min Torah. So he says, I don't have to go into all this thing about shiurim. Alken, lo echtov el dvarim hatzrichin. I'm only going to tell you things that are necessary. V'asader yachad dvarim hadomim, and then I'll lay out things that are similar. And so now this is interesting. So so given the fact that he's now introduced this section of halacha by saying, I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail. And, we know the malachot. So, but now he has to figure out, nonetheless, what order is he going to present the halachot in? And bearing in mind, beginning with the Rambam. The Rambam is really arguably the first person who makes a comprehensive code of law where he determined the order, right? Because otherwise the order had been determined mainly by the Mishnah and the Gemara. But the Tur wasn't the only one since the Rambam, but the Tur became very popular. And the Tur also is concerned about the order of halachot. So he says, as he's trying to conceptualize how am I going to lay out these halachot, he says, "Vatchil behiluch." I'm going to start off with walking or going. In other words, as a theme, it's going to be a halachic theme. Hayech yehehi lucho b'Shabbat. How should someone go? How is someone's hiluch? How is their way of going on Shabbat? And uvameha ish yotzei. What is a man allowed to wear? The tikkun begadav, and the way his clothes are. Uvameha isha yotza. How does a woman go out on Shabbos? V'ha'eved, or a servant, or behema, an animal. V'isur cheftzav, and also the forbidden things that have to do with his everyday dealings. V'hadibur behem, and talking about them. V'heter chavtzei shamayim, and the permissible things that have to do with things that heaven wants you to do. The tiltul, and carrying, or moving things around. Chachamim learned the isur of tiltul from this. Kevanchi is navish, from what? In other words, tiltul, the idea of not moving things that are muktzah, is an isur de rabbanan. So where did the rabbanan get it from? He said it has to do with this idea of what things are really permitted to go about doing or thinking about on Shabbat. And because we learn it from the Navi, Shelo yehi hiluch v'sicha shel Shabbat, ki hiluch v'sicha shel chol. Right? We learn this idea that it's not from the Torah, but we learn it from Nevi'im, that you're the way you go about your business on Shabbos is not the way you do it on Chol. Not moving things around should be different. The way you move things around on Shabbos should be qualitatively different than on Chol. That your Shabbos shouldn't be like a Yom Chol. Because otherwise you're going to come to, let's say, move all of your stuff, like you're going to take Shabbos to rearrange the furniture in your house, or to move all the things in your warehouse from one place to another, because you'll say, look, I don't have anything to do. And then he'll want to do something, so he'll say, it's Shabbos, I'm allowed to move things around. He'll move them around. But then he'll end up not really being shovet on Shabbat, not really stopping and resting. So he's laying out for you the order in which he's going to bring halachot. And he says, Achar kach binyan ohel v'tzeda ukshira ubishul breira skita v'tikun ma'achal adam ma'achal behema v'davar hanitzot b'shabbat l'tzorech goy l'tzorech Yisrael o haviyom yichutz latchum. Right, so he's now laying out the next set of halachot. These are the next things I'm going to talk about. And ultimately, I'm also going to talk about washing and anointing, the kol refuah, and also any kind of healing, pikuach nefesh, v'yoledet, a woman who just gave birth, v'tzarchei milah, and then in light of that, what about how you do a brit on Shabbat, v'holadat behema, and if you're allowed to help an animal give birth on Shabbat, refuata, and healing an animal, pinui makom noachim, or making room for guests. Saving things from a fire. If a fire breaks out on Shabbos, what are you allowed to move away from its path? Shabbat below Seder, and then some halachot of Shabbat without that would not have a particular order. And then I'll talk about the four Rishuyot, and I'll talk a little bit about Hotza'ah, etc. And the rest of it has to do with Hotza'ah and Eruv. Anyway, so he lays out for you his intention in terms of how he wants to order all these halachot. So he says, now he's going to start in earnest. He says, K'tiv, it's written, Im tashimi Shabbat raglecha. Right? Pasuk in Yeshayahu, if you have your, if your foot, have your leg rests on Shabbat. V'darshu chazal shelo yehei hiluchach shel Shabbat, hiluchach shel chol. Chazal darshan, he said, it means that you're walking or going on Shabbos shouldn't be the way you go on chol. Al kain ein lo la'adam larutz b'Shabbat kadei she'oseh b'chol. So therefore, a person shouldn't run on Shabbos the way you would run on chol. But if you run to shul, that's okay. I'm going to skip the next. Well, I'll just say, okay. Katuv b'Sefer HaTruma, Bachurim hamitangin b'kfitzatam uv'mrutzatam. It's an interesting halacha. That young men, Bachurim, could be young men or it could be children, like older children, that get pleasure from jumping and running, mutar, that's permitted for them. And then also to see anything that brings pleasure, that's permitted on Shabbat. Okay, now everybody's falling asleep. We're up to the part that I wanted to show you. So again, how does this halacha come here? Because the Torah is saying, now I'm coming to these things about Isurei Shabbat, and he sent the in between the lines. He's saying, I'm not going to go necessarily in the same order that the Mishnah goes when it goes through all of the Lamed Tet Melachot, but I'm going to go through my own conceptual way. I'm going to start off by talking about walking. And so now we come to our halacha. Hayaholech, you're walking on Shabbat, v'higia la'amat hamayim, and you come to some water. Yachol ledaleg v'likpotz aleh, you could jump over it. Afil yimini rechava, even if it's so wide, she'eno yachol laniach raglo rishona kodem she'akor hashniya, even if you can't put your foot down before you lifted up your other foot. In other words, you would literally jump. Even if you have to jump, you're allowed to jump over the water on Shabbat. But it's better if you jump over water rather than walking around it. Because that means you're walking more than you have to. And you shouldn't walk through it because you'll come to squeeze out. So this is this idea of why. So this is the way the Torah understands why you're not allowed to walk through water l'chatchila on Shabbos is not because you're going to come to pick up your garment and carry it, the way Rashi said. It's because you may come to squeeze out your beged. The next thing we learned in Hilchot Yom Kippurim, Haya holechet var mitzvah, kigon lahakbil pnei rabo, pnei mi shegadol mimenu b'chachma yachol la'avor ba. Right, so if you're going to do a mitzvah, you're allowed to go through water on Shabbos, shinui, as long as you do make some kind of a difference. Kigon shelo yotzi yado mitachet tzvat chalukah. It's like, for example, not taking your hand from underneath the hem of your garment. Again, Rashi understood this differently. And he understood that the idea was that that of taking your hand from beneath your garment would be to lift it up and carry it. And the Tur understands that you don't do it because we're worried that if you take your hand out, you may squeeze out the water from your garment. Yasur Lavur Baba Sandalo, and this is finally the Gemara that we just looked at. You're not allowed to go through water while wearing sandals. The Chayshinan Dilma Nafil. We're worried that they may fall off. Atava Tuye, then you come to carry them. About Beminalo Mutar to no Nafil, but you're allowed to go wearing shoes because they don't fall off. Okay, everybody, thank you for joining me.
See you next week.
See you next week. Have a Chodesh Tov.
Bye bye.
Shabbat Shalom.